MANSUR al Hallaj, the martyr of divine love. He was born in the remote countryside of Fars, near the ancient roads that wound through Persia's dusty expanses. Even as a child, he was drawn to the haunting call of the unseen. There are stories told by those who lived long enough to remember him in childhood that he would often stand alone in a courtyard or a field, staring into the horizon with an expression that vacillated between intense joy and a kind of holy sorrow. In those first years, a certain restlessness flickered in his eyes, a hint of the endless travels of both body and spirit he would undertake. His name was Abu al-Mughith al-Hussein ibn Mansur, known to the ages simply as MANSUR al Hallaj. It was said his father had once been a cotton carder, moving from village to village to ply his trade. The moniker al-Hallaj, in fact, refers to the profession of cotton carding. By the time Mansur was born, his family was neither wealthy nor influential, but there was an air of quiet dignity about them. From his father, Mansur inherited a resolute determination, and from his mother, a softness of heart. It was that delicate balance, determination fused with compassion, that would define him in the eyes of both admirers and detractors. Life in the Persian countryside allowed Mansur a slow, thoughtful childhood. In the early morning, he would often follow his father into the fields, where cotton was gathered and eventually carded by skilled hands. The rhythmic swish of the tools that separated fibers from seeds might have left an imprint on his mind, so much so that decades later, even as he wandered far from his place of birth, that gentle sound would sometimes drift into his recollection, reminding him of simpler days. But while the other village children played without concern for the deeper mysteries of existence, Mansur found himself consumed by questions of creation, the purpose of life, and the nature of the divine. He would watch the birds soar overhead and wonder about the effortless grace with which they navigated the skies. He would sit beside a stream and contemplate how the water continually flowed. Never the same drop twice, just as life itself seemed to pass from moment to moment in a perpetual state of flux. By the age of 12, Mansur was already known for his unquenchable thirst for knowledge. He listened in rapt attention whenever traveling merchants or wandering ascetics told stories of distant lands. It was in the whispered legends of Mecca, Medina, Baghdad, and further that Mansur's imagination ignited. Something in those stories tugged at him, as though beckoning him to leave his small world behind and seek something infinitely larger. His father saw the glimmer of yearning in Mansur's eyes and took him aside one afternoon. They stood by a field of tall grass, swaying in the breeze. "You wish to see the world," his father observed, more as a statement than a question. Mansur nodded. "There are those who say that knowledge of God can be found in the far corners of the earth," he replied softly. "But I think it is in the heart as well." His father said nothing for a moment, placing a calloused hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember that the greatest journey you can undertake is inward. But yes, you must go and you must learn. Only return if your heart tells you to. If it does not, may God guide your steps wherever they lead." It was not long after that, while still in his early teens, that Mansur found himself under the tutelage of Sahl al-Tustari, one of the well-known ascetics of the time. Tustari was a man of slight stature, his eyes gleaming with an otherworldly fire. He was known for his rigorous practice of self-discipline and the depth of his mystical reflections. Mansur approached him in awe, but quickly discovered that Tustari was approachable and warm, prone to long silences, broken only by incisive questions that cut to the core of one's being. Under Tustari's guidance, Mansur engaged in lengthy periods of fasting, prayer, and contemplation. He learned to still the mind and focus on the rhythmic recitation of Quranic verses, allowing their layered meanings to sink into the depths of his consciousness. Tustari often spoke of divine love, likening it to an irresistible magnet that pulls the soul ever closer to its origin. It was in Tustari's presence that Mansur first experienced the sweet ecstasy that comes from forgetting oneself in the remembrance of God. Many nights, his fellow disciples would find him in the corner of the small, dimly lit prayer room, lost in a silent communion, tears streaming down his cheeks. As time went on, Mansur's hunger for wisdom and devotion only grew. Though still a teenager, he displayed an intensity of practice that outstripped many of his elders. Tustari, while proud of his students' fervor, also recognized a certain danger in it. Mansur was like a moth circling the flame. At times, Tustari would caution him, warning that drawing too near to the divine mystery without the tempering wisdom of balance could consume him. But Mansur could not, perhaps would not, contain the longing that roiled within him. By his late teens, Mansur left Tustari to seek further teaching. He traveled to Basra, a city that, with its bustling trade and diverse population, was a center for scholarship and mysticism. There, he encountered groups of ascetics and mystical thinkers who had begun to be referred to as Sufis. Some devoted themselves to strict asceticism, wearing coarse woolen garments, hence one of the origins of the term Sufi, and some practiced forms of remembrance, dhikr, that involved chanting divine names or verses with such intensity that the mind seemed to transcend ordinary awareness. Mansur's presence in Basra brought him into contact with various luminaries, but among them, none was more revered than Junaid of Baghdad, who occasionally visited Basra or received visitors from there. While direct contact between Mansur and Junaid remains a subject of debate among historians, some say their relationship was distant, others say it was profound. The narratives that circulated later in Mansur's life placed him in Junaid's sphere. Junaid was cautious in his teaching, advocating a sober mysticism that emphasized humility and discretion. He taught that profound spiritual experiences and insights into the nature of God should largely remain veiled to the public, shared only with those capable of understanding them in the right spirit. Mansur's path, however, seemed destined for another direction, a direction that would eventually lead him into dangerous territory. He was not content with the idea of keeping the deepest truths hidden. He believed with every fiber of his being that God's love was meant to be proclaimed, shared, and lived in the open. It was not enough for him to practice devotion in secrecy. He wanted to awaken the hearts of ordinary men and women, to show them the blazing presence of the divine in their everyday lives. This compulsion to share, to teach, and even to provoke would become a hallmark of Mansur's approach. In his mid-20s, Mansur undertook his first pilgrimage to Mecca. Clad in simple garments, he joined the swaths of pilgrims who converged on the holy city. During that first journey, he was struck by the unity of people from diverse backgrounds converging for a single purpose, to worship God and follow in the footsteps of the Prophet. Standing on the plains of Arafat, Mansur felt that the distinctions between tribes, languages, and social classes melted away in the face of the divine reality that overshadowed them all. The experience left him trembling with awe, and it deepened his conviction that the presence of God was not a distant abstraction, but a living, immediate reality that could be experienced directly by the sincere seeker. He stayed in Mecca for a year, performing the pilgrimage rites more than once, and dedicating himself to intense worship. He was often found in the Kaaba's vicinity, prostrating for hours, forgetting to eat or sleep. Some accounts claim that in those days, Mansur would pass entire nights in supplication, whispering prayers of love and longing as though speaking intimately with a friend. At times, he was seen gazing upon the Kaaba with tears, and at other times, with a radiant smile, as if he beheld in the black stone a reflection of the ineffable. When Mansur emerged from that extended period in Mecca, his heart was set ablaze even more intensely. He now believed that the union between the individual soul and God was not merely an abstract theological concept, but a reality that one could taste directly. In letters that he sent to friends, he spoke of an indescribable presence in his breast, a living flame of divine consciousness that seemed to speak through him. There are stories, admittedly hard to verify, suggesting that during his stay in Mecca, Mansur began to utter exclamations that implied a profound union with the divine. Perhaps he was careful enough to keep them to a whisper at that early stage. But the seeds of what would later become his most famous utterance were already present. Upon his return to Basra, Mansur began to gather a small circle of disciples who were drawn by the magnetism of his personality and the depth of his devotion. Unlike some Sufi teachers who emphasized seclusion and silence, Mansur spoke passionately and poetically about God's overwhelming love. He shared parables and stories, weaving them with Quranic verses and the sayings of the Prophet. His gatherings were marked by an atmosphere of intense sincerity. Some of his devotees would weep openly as he described the soul's yearning for its source. Yet Mansur also attracted critics. Some thought him too bold, too eager to speak of mystical union and the mysteries of divine love in public. They feared that ordinary people, untrained in theological and spiritual subtleties, might misunderstand his words. Others were concerned that Mansur's apparent ecstasy could lead him to heresy or to illusions about his own spiritual state. Whispers spread in the markets and mosques, questioning whether Mansur al Hallaj was a saintly figure or a dangerous fanatic. Mansur seemed unconcerned by these rumors. He believed that those who truly wished to understand him would do so through their own hearts, not through the judgments of society or the legalistic constraints of the religious authorities. During this time, Mansur also traveled to various regions, including Khuzestan and Khorasan. Everywhere he went, his teachings sparked both devotion and controversy. He began to develop a reputation as a wandering holy man who radiated an aura of love, but whose words could unsettle even the most learned scholars. He did not merely repeat conventional religious teachings. Instead, he spoke about annihilation in God, fana, the obliteration of the ego, and the dawning realization that only God truly is. Such concepts were not new among the Sufis, but Mansur's manner of expression was direct, almost confrontational. Whereas others couched their utterances in layers of metaphor, Mansur sometimes spoke in a language so stark that it left listeners gasping. It was around this period that the utterance that would forever be associated with him began to crystallize. Ana al-Haqq, I am the truth, or I am reality. Haqq is one of the names of God in Islamic theology, signifying the ultimate reality and truth. For Mansur to declare I am al-Haqq was at best a highly provocative statement. At worst it was perceived as outright heresy, since it appeared to blur the boundary between the creator and the created. Yet Mansur's defenders, then and now, assert that he did not utter those words from the standpoint of his individual ego. Rather, they say, he spoke from the station of total annihilation in God, fanafillah, wherein the sense of a separate self is lost and only the divine reality remains. In that ineffable state, the mystic does not so much claim divinity as become a pure conduit through which the divine speaks. These subtleties, however, were lost on many of his contemporaries. The murmurings of heresy grew louder. Some claimed that Mansur had declared himself God, an allegation that was both serious and, given the orthodox theological context, potentially deadly. Mansur, for his part, refused to recant or explain himself in a way that would appease the conservative scholars and jurists. He believed that spiritual truths were not subject to the limitations of ordinary language and rational discourse. To try to confine them or dilute them to fit the comfort of the masses would be to betray the divine radiance he had experienced. His circle of followers, however, expanded, comprised of those yearning for direct experiential knowledge of God. Mansur taught them the importance of love above all else. He insisted that love was the true path to understanding the divine, love so deep that it eradicates the false sense of self. He would often say that a single moment of genuine love in the heart could outweigh a lifetime of mechanical worship if the latter lacked sincerity. This resonated powerfully with many who felt constricted by a purely formal practice of religion, but it further fueled the ire of religious authorities who saw in his teachings a threat to established norms. In time, Mansur's travels and teachings brought him to Baghdad, then the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate and a major center of Islamic learning and scholarship. Baghdad was a city of scholars, poets, philosophers, jurists, and theologians, a melting pot of cultural and intellectual currents. Mansur arrived with both a reputation and a mission. He had become something of a celebrity in certain circles, while also attracting the watchful eye of those who considered him a heretic. In Baghdad, he continued his open discourses. He frequented mosques, homes of patrons, and Sufi gatherings, where he spoke unabashedly of the soul's longing for God. He spoke of the heart as the real Kaaba, a holy sanctuary that, if purified, would reveal the divine presence in all things. He also performed acts of charity, giving away much of what he had to the poor and destitute. His disciples recounted miracles, times when he seemed to multiply food or heal the sick with his prayers. These stories, as such stories tend to do, proliferated and became part of the legend that grew around him. But in a city like Baghdad, where scholars were keen to protect orthodoxy, his every word was scrutinized. Rumors circulated about his statements regarding al-Haqq. Some claimed he had repeated those words in crowded gatherings, inflaming the sensibilities of the learned classes. Others accused him of leading astray the youth, teaching them a dangerous mysticism that undermined respect for religious law and authority. In short, Mansur was treading on treacherous ground. It was around this time that he put pen to paper, at least in a more organized fashion, composing what would later be known as the Kitab al-Tawasin, the Book of Tasin. In this work he used cryptic language, symbols and dialogues, some between Iblis, Satan and God, and others between the mystic and the divine, to convey his insights. It was not a book meant for the uninitiated. Even some of his admirers found it perplexing or troubling. But those closest to him claimed that its passages provide a window into the intensity of Mansur's inner experiences, as though he were mapping out a hidden territory of consciousness that few dare to enter. Its pages contained both the sweetness of union and the anguish of separation, reflecting Mansur's ever-present dance between ecstasy and longing. As the atmosphere in Baghdad grew more tense, Mansur's public discourses became flashpoints of controversy. He was taken to task by conservative theologians who demanded that he clarify his statements or recant them. Mansur, unwavering, insisted that his words were misunderstood, that he had never claimed to be God in the ordinary sense. But he would not shy away from al-Haqq either, for to him that utterance was not a personal claim but a realization of the fundamental truth of existence. Eventually, the Abbasid authorities, prodded by powerful religious scholars, decided that he posed too great a threat. The political climate of the time was fraught. The Abbasid Caliphate was trying to maintain unity and order in the face of various internal challenges. A popular mystic going around proclaiming controversial spiritual doctrines was an unpredictable element that could spark unrest. Mansur was arrested and brought to trial. The specific charges ranged from heresy to inciting unrest, but at their core, they centered on the theological implications of his utterances. The trial was a protracted affair, with Mansur given opportunities to retract his most controversial statements or to offer an interpretation that would be acceptable to the orthodox establishment. A number of leading figures, including Junaid, were said to have cautioned Mansur to be circumspect, to present his words in a manner that would spare him from accusations of heresy. But Mansur refused to sanitize the truth as he saw it. This obstinacy sealed his fate. He was ultimately condemned by a council of jurists who found him guilty of blasphemy. Their reasoning was that by saying Ana al-Haqq, he effectively equated himself with God, a transgression that could not be excused by mere claims of mystical rapture. For nearly 11 years, Mansur languished in prison in Baghdad. Some accounts describe his imprisonment as harsh. He was reportedly chained and deprived of basic comforts. Yet there is a certain luminosity to the stories of his time in captivity. His disciples claim that even in the darkest conditions, he remained in a state of spiritual exaltation, continuing to teach those who could visit him and writing letters filled with love and longing for God. Prison guards and fellow inmates, witnessing his equanimity and compassion, were sometimes moved to tears. According to these accounts, even incarceration could not quell the flame that burned in his heart. As his imprisonment dragged on, there were periodic attempts by certain sympathetic figures to have him freed or to have his sentence commuted. But the political climate and the entrenchment of religious conservatism thwarted these efforts. Over time, the authorities seemed to grow weary of the case. They concluded that a decisive example must be made to deter others from following in Mansur's radical mystical footsteps. So the order was given that Mansur al Halaj be publicly executed. According to historical accounts, he was subjected to severe torture before being crucified, a form of punishment meant to demonstrate utter condemnation. The date typically given for his execution is 922 CE. The chronicles describe a harrowing scene. Mansur was led out into public, beaten, and then fixed to a gibbet, or a cross-like structure. Some say his limbs were severed before he was left to die. Throughout the ordeal, he is said to have uttered prayers, and there are moving legends that at the moment of his greatest suffering, he continuously chanted the name of God, asking for forgiveness not for himself, but for those who carried out the sentence. The bystanders included the curious, the devout, and the indifferent. Some accounts mention that certain spectators wept or fainted when they saw the serenity on Mansur's face. Others spat at him, believing he was an accursed heretic. Legends abound about extraordinary occurrences at the time of his death, a bright light emanating from his body, or the smell of perfume filling the air. Historians differ in their views on these miraculous stories, but all agree that his execution was a defining moment that sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. In the aftermath of his execution, Mansur's body was said to have been burned and his ashes scattered, a final attempt by the authorities to erase his presence. Yet paradoxically, his memory only grew in power and resonance after his death. Poets, mystics, and theologians across the centuries would invoke his name. He became, in some circles, the ultimate symbol of the spiritual lover who gives up everything, even life itself, for the sake of divine truth. Sufis especially saw in him a martyr of love, someone who exemplified the station of annihilation, fana, and the station of permanence in God, Baqqa, beyond the reach of worldly limitations. In the centuries that followed, Mansur al Hallaj was both vilified and sanctified. Conservative theologians cited him as a cautionary example, a man so intoxicated by mystical ecstasy that he blasphemed against God. Yet many Sufis hailed him as one of the greatest saints, a luminous soul who touched the highest truths and paid the ultimate price for it. His works, including the Tawasin, were preserved and studied by those interested in the deeper currents of Islamic mysticism. His poems, too, carried echoes of his central message, that love is the path to God, and that in the depths of love one discovers that the self is not separate from the divine. Over time, numerous commentaries were written to explain his most controversial sayings in a way consistent with orthodox Islamic theology. One of the key interpretive frameworks is that when Mansur said Ana al-Haqq, he did not speak as Mansur but as a soul annihilated in God, so that only God was speaking through him. In the same way, a drop of water merged into the ocean can no longer claim independent existence. It becomes the ocean. Yet this theological subtlety did not protect Mansur in his own era, where the literal reading of his words spelled doom. Historians also suggest that political dynamics played a role in his downfall. The Abbasid regime was battling various forces of unrest, and a figure like Mansur, widely followed and defiant of conventional authority, posed too great a risk. The spiritual teachings that emanate from Mansur's life continue to influence Sufi thought to this day. Central to his message is the idea that true worship arises from an all-consuming love for God. For Mansur, formal rites and rituals, while important, were hollow if not infused with sincerity and the ardor of longing. He challenged the faithful to move beyond a transactional approach to religion, where one performs devotions expecting rewards, and instead abandon themselves entirely to divine grace. He also spoke passionately about the unity of existence. In some of his utterances, he implies that everything, in its deepest essence, is a theophany, an expression of the divine. The distinction between the creator and creation, while critical in mainstream Islamic theology, takes on a nuanced meaning in the mystical perspective. Creation is not God, but creation is also never separate from God, being perpetually sustained and given existence by the divine command. Mansur pushed this understanding to its outer limits, proclaiming a degree of unity that scandalized those who insisted on a sharp demarcation between the human and the divine. Another aspect of Mansur's teachings is compassion for all beings. Stories about him often recount how he would treat even the lowliest of creatures with kindness. He once allegedly scolded a disciple for stepping on an ant intentionally, pointing out that the ant was also a creature bearing the mark of its creator. This radical sense of interconnectedness extended to how he viewed the poor and the marginalized. He would give away his possessions without hesitation, to the extent that he sometimes had nothing left for himself. He saw God reflected in every face, and thus to serve creation was to serve the beloved. A lesser-known facet of Mansur's life is his marriage and family life. While details are sparse, some traditions maintain that he was married and had children. Indeed, the question arises of how someone so absorbed in mystical ecstasy could fulfill the duties of a husband and father. Accounts differ. Some say that Mansur was neglectful of his familial responsibilities, while others assert that he was kind and supportive, though often absent due to his travels. Regardless, the tragedies he endured likely weighed heavily on his loved ones. Their grief is seldom mentioned in historical records, overshadowed by Mansur's towering spiritual legacy. One cannot speak of Mansur al Hallaj without addressing the concept of spoken mysticism. Many Sufi masters before and after him experienced states of rapture, but most adhered to the principle that such states must remain hidden, the doctrine of sober Sufism. Mansur, by contrast, practiced what might be called an ecstatic Sufism, openly declaring his experiences. This openness was both his gift and his downfall. While it attracted countless souls hungry for a taste of divine intimacy, it also outraged the gatekeepers of orthodoxy. Even among the Sufis, some viewed his behavior as reckless. Figures like Junaid allegedly advised him to practice restraint, but Mansur saw no choice. For him, concealing the truth was a betrayal of it. In the post-Halajian tradition, many Sufis strove to reconcile the ecstatic expressions of love with the demands of Sharia, Islamic law. They developed a language of metaphor and symbolism, cloaking the boldness of mystic utterances in poetry and allegory. The Persian poet Attar, and the later luminary Rumi, for instance, spoke of the annihilation of the self and the intimate dance with the divine. But they used metaphorical language, wine, the tavern, the beloved, to convey these realities. Mansur's directness, in contrast, remained a stark testament to the risks of unveiling the hidden truths in unvarnished form. Yet, in the centuries since, many have come to see Mansur's execution as a tragic misunderstanding, one that underscores the peril mystics face when they cross the boundary between personal rapture and public proclamation. He stands as an emblem of what can happen when spiritual insight collides with temporal power. The tension between mysticism and orthodoxy is a recurring theme in Islamic history, and indeed in the history of many religious traditions. Mansur's case, however, is one of the most dramatic, ensuring that his name remains etched in collective memory. Over the years, his figure has been romanticized in Sufi literature. Some depict him as the archetypal lover, intoxicated by the wine of divine love, wholly unconcerned with worldly consequences. Others present him as a misunderstood teacher, someone who tried to elevate the masses toward higher truths, but was crucified for his trouble, reminiscent of narratives in other religious traditions. In many ways, Mansur al Hallaj has become a universal symbol of the mystic's predicament. The necessity of sharing an inexpressible truth in a world that demands clear definitions and boundaries. In some cultural memory, Mansur's final words before his death have been reported as, "O God, if you had revealed to them what you have revealed to me, they would not have condemned me. If you had withheld from me what you withheld from them, I would not have been tested. To you belongs the final judgment." Whether or not these were his exact words, the sentiment captures the essence of how Sufis interpret his life story. He was granted a revelation so profound that ordinary measures of orthodoxy could not accommodate it. And so he was tested in the most excruciating way, ultimately fulfilling the role of the sacrificial lover who cries out his beloved's name even as the world silences him. In theological terms, modern scholarship has sought to analyze Mansur's statements through the lens of metaphorical expression. Many scholars argue that to view his words literally misses the point of Sufi discourse, which often relies on symbolic language to describe transcendent experiences. The phrase "Ana al-Haqq" is thus interpreted as a statement of the soul's realization that nothing exists but God, and that the personal self is an illusion. From this perspective, the scandal was rooted not in true heresy, but in the limited understanding of those who judged him. Still, the question persists: could Mansur al Hallaj have tempered his message to save himself? Would that have been a betrayal of the truth he felt commanded to share? These questions resurface in each generation, particularly among those who wrestle with how to communicate mystical insights in a world bound by dogma and fear. Mansur's life offers no simple answers, only the powerful example of someone who refused to compromise, even when it cost him everything. It is important too to note that Mansur's legacy was shaped not only by fellow Sufis, but also by poets, who were captivated by the dramatic narrative of his life. The Persian poet Attar, in his famous work Memorial of the Saints, recounts stories of Mansur's sayings and actions that highlight his unwavering devotion. Later, Jalal al-Din Rumi refers to Mansur as the ultimate lover, one who willingly opened his arms to the stake of martyrdom for the sake of love's ecstasy. Through poetry, Mansur's spirit traversed cultural and linguistic boundaries, resonating with Christians, Hindus, and others who found in him a reflection of universal mystical longing. Indeed, some have even compared him to Christian martyrs, noting parallels in the theme of sacrifice for divine love. For centuries, theologians and jurists continued to debate the doctrinal implications of Mansur's utterances. A few tried to rehabilitate him posthumously by presenting him as an eccentric but orthodox Sufi. Others denounced his memory, claiming that no matter the nuance, certain boundaries must never be crossed. Hence, even in death, Mansur al Hallaj remained a polarizing figure, simultaneously canonized and condemned. Yet the common people, the ordinary souls who often find solace in mystics more than in scholars, kept his memory alive in poems, songs, and anecdotes. His story became a cautionary tale about the cost of loving God too openly in a world that fears transcendence. It also became a story of hope for those who believed that true love transcends even the cruelty of torture and execution. In small Sufi lodges from the Maghreb to the Indian subcontinent, Mansur's name was invoked as a saintly presence, someone who had touched the eternal and died in its embrace. If one were to sift through all the legends, historical accounts, theological arguments, and poetic tributes, one would find amidst the many layers a simple thread tying them all together. Mansur al Hallaj lived and died for the conviction that the divine is nearer to us than our own breath, and that acknowledging that fact in our words and deeds is the highest calling. Everything else, his ecstatic utterances, his trial, his torture, is an outgrowth of that central realization. It is said that after Mansur's execution, some of his most devoted disciples continued to celebrate his life and teachings in secrecy, passing down stories and fragments of his works as precious relics. Over time, the edges of his narrative blurred, giving rise to a hagiographic tradition. In some tales, angels descended at the moment of his death. In others, flowers grew miraculously from the blood-soaked earth beneath his gibbet. Whether one sees these as pious legends or symbolic truths, they reflect the deep impression he left on the collective imagination. From a theological standpoint, the lessons drawn from Mansur's life include the paramount importance of humility, even when one experiences spiritual exaltation. Many Sufi masters point out that if one truly merges in divine unity, one loses the personal sense of I altogether, and thus remains silent about it. Mansur, they suggest, erred in proclaiming aloud what was meant to remain within the sanctuary of the heart. Others counter that it was precisely Mansur's mission to break the walls of silence, to remind the world of a truth it had forgotten. Whichever interpretation one adopts, Mansur's story remains a vivid testament to the tension between the inward mystical path and the outward forms of religion. Historically, Mansur al Hallaj stands at the crossroads of Islamic mysticism's early development. He emerged in an era when Sufism was taking shape in different currents, from the sober and scholarly approach of figures like Junaid to the more ecstatic expressions of others like Bayezid Bastami. Mansur, in many ways, represented the extreme of the ecstatic path, pushing the boundaries of language to capture experiences that defied conventional theology. The backlash he faced was part of the process by which the broader Islamic community negotiated the limits of acceptable mysticism. In the aftermath of his ordeal, Sufis became more cautious, developing elaborate systems of esoteric exegesis and symbolic language to avoid triggering alarm among the religious authorities. Despite these cautionary strategies, Mansur's legacy exerted a powerful influence on later generations of mystics, especially in the Persianate world. Poets like Hafiz and later, philosophers like Mulla Sadra grappled with the nature of divine love and unity in their works. The notion that the human soul could, in some ineffable way, be one with God found manifold expressions in Persian Sufi poetry, albeit softened with metaphors of wine, the cupbearer, and the tavern. Yet behind those metaphors, one can sense the fiery spirit of Mansur lingering in the background. In modern times, Mansur al Hallaj has been embraced by spiritual seekers outside of Islam as well. Translations of his words appear in anthologies of mystics and saints from around the world. Some see in his life a parallel to that of Jesus, who was also condemned for seemingly blasphemous claims of divine sonship. Others relate him to Eastern figures who speak of the dissolution of the individual self into the cosmic self. Thus, Mansur al Hallaj has transcended the boundaries of his historical and cultural context to become a universal symbol of the soul's quest for union with the Absolute. Yet it would be a disservice to reduce Mansur to just a symbol. He was, by all historical accounts, a living, breathing man of the late 9th and early 10th centuries, who walked the streets of Basra and Baghdad, prayed in the holy sanctuaries of Mecca, and wrote letters to his friends. He experienced hunger, thirst, loneliness, and the stirrings of human emotion. He had disciples who looked to him for guidance, a family that worried for his safety, and adversaries determined to silence him. He was a product of the Islamic Golden Age, steeped in Quranic learning, conversant with the religious sciences of his day, but also fiercely independent in his spiritual explorations. To understand his teachings, one must look to his emphasis on love. For Mansur, love was not a metaphor, but a reality that envelops and transforms the lover. In love, all dualities melt away. The lover, the beloved, and the act of loving converge into a single, boundless unity. It is from this perspective that one might hear the utterance Ana al-Haqq, not as a statement of personal divinity, but as a cry of the soul recognizing that only the beloved truly is. This teaching resonates through the ages, inviting each seeker to consider the nature of the divine, not as a distant monarch, but as the life that animates every heartbeat. In addition to love, Mansur taught the virtue of surrender. He believed that no progress could be made on the spiritual path without relinquishing the claims of the ego. The outward symbols of religious identity, titles, credentials, even certain external practices, could become barriers if they fortified the sense of I. True surrender meant giving oneself so completely to God that nothing remained to obstruct the divine flow. This is why Mansur's final moments on the gibbet are sometimes interpreted as the culmination of his teaching. He surrendered not just his possessions, not just his reputation, but even his life. In doing so, he dramatized in the starkest manner possible the mystical dictum that only when the self is sacrificed does the soul attain union. Historians tell us that in the aftermath of his death, the Abbasid court turned its attention to other matters, believing that the threat posed by Mansur's mysticism had been extinguished. How shocked they would be to learn that centuries later, his name would still be spoken with reverence by countless Sufis, that his words would be studied, commented upon, and immortalized in verse, and that pilgrims from lands far removed from Baghdad's heyday would come to recite or recall his story as part of their own spiritual odysseys. To observe Mansur al Hallaj's continuing impact, one might visit shrines and Sufi centers in regions where his memory is kept alive. Though there is no grand mausoleum for him, his body was scattered to the winds. His spiritual presence is felt wherever hearts burn with the same longing that consumed him. One hears echoes of his message in the Qawalis of South Asia, in the whirling of dervishes in Turkey, in the meditative circles of North Africa, and in the quiet corners where solitary worshippers recite his name under their breath, as though summoning an old friend. What can be learned from his life? At the very least, the cautionary tale that spiritual truths, when laid bare, can threaten established orders. Yet beyond caution, there is inspiration. Mansur's life encourages seekers to probe the depths of devotion, to move beyond formulaic worship into the realm of direct, unmediated experience. It challenges one to maintain integrity even in the face of dire consequences. It suggests that while religious institutions are vital for communal coherence, the spirit's journey may sometimes lead beyond institutional boundaries. And it reminds us that the line between reverence and heresy, between saint and criminal, can be alarmingly thin when viewed through the lens of power and orthodoxy. Of course, no single narrative can fully capture Mansur al Hallaj. He remains, even to this day, a figure wrapped in enigma. Scholars continue to debate the authenticity of certain statements attributed to him, the influence he had on other mystics, and the precise theological stance he held. Devotees recount miraculous tales that historians might question, but perhaps this multiplicity of perspectives is fitting for a man who devoted himself to the ineffable. His life and death resist neat categorization, as does the boundless reality he proclaimed. In the centuries since, other Sufis would echo Mansur's boldness in their poetry, though often shielding their declarations in the cloak of allegory. Figures like Iraqi, Shabistari, and even the great Rumi touched upon the theme of the soul's unity with God. Yet none so directly challenged society's boundaries as Mansur did. In a sense, Mansur had to be the sacrificial figure to open a path that others could walk more cautiously. He became a mythic ancestor for ecstatic lovers of God, a spiritual role model of the highest order. And so his story, whispered through the annals of Sufi lore, remains profoundly relevant. It is not merely a historical episode, but a timeless mirror into which each generation can gaze, contemplating the mystery of divine love and human devotion. His life teaches that the station of the lover is to transcend fear, fear of censure, fear of suffering, fear of death itself, and to rest wholly in the beloved. Such a path is not for the faint of heart, and most will choose more moderate expressions of faith. Yet Mansur beckons to those who dare. Come, see what it means to love with your entire being. If one tries to sum up his teaching in a single phrase, one might choose love God until nothing remains of you. That was Mansur al Hallaj's creed, made manifest in his prayers, his writings, his public utterances, and ultimately his martyrdom. He loved until the very notion of Mansur vanished into the flames of divine presence, leaving behind only the name of God echoing on his lips. Though centuries have passed, Mansur's voice can still be heard in the hush of spiritual gatherings, in the verses of inspired poets, and in the stirring hearts of seekers. It resounds in the lines of Rumi. He spilled his heart's blood, and thereby grew in spirit. It resonates in the Sufi rituals of remembrance, where dervishes chant God's names until their consciousness merges into a single ocean of devotion, and it quietly infiltrates the theological debates of modern scholars who attempt to parse his meaning, unaware that the depths he plumbed cannot be fully contained by academic discourse. In the end, Mansur al Hallaj's life is about surrender to the mystery that envelops us all. He stands as a witness to what can happen when the veil is lifted, if only for an instant, and the soul glimpses the radiant face of its origin. That glimpse for Mansur was so overwhelming that he could not remain silent. And so he spoke, he taught, and he paid a terrible price in the eyes of the world. But perhaps in the unseen realm it was no price at all, only the final release into the one he adored. Generations continue to marvel at his courage, to lament his fate, and to ponder the eternal question his life raises. How close is God to each of us, and how would we speak if we truly believed there was no separation? Mansur al Hallaj's answer was uncompromising, echoing still, Ana al-Haqq. I am the truth, I am reality, for I am nothing, and only the real remains. The story of his life and death, told and retold across the ages, serves as a radiant testament to the power of that realization, and the storms it can provoke in a world not yet ready to behold the fullness of its own depths. And so, his memory endures, not as a fossilized relic of history, but as a living flame of possibility, igniting in every generation those few souls who dare to proclaim through love that the distance between creator and creation is nothing but a fleeting illusion.
Oh.